In early 1945, the western part of Germany had lost its former shape on the map, and large cities had been reduced to ashes under constant air raids. Railway hubs had been blown into twisted strips of iron, and the defensive line along the Rhine was being pushed back. As the lingering chill of winter pressed down on the land, hunger moved from village to village. People's steps grew slower than in previous years, and the smell of coal mixed with the damp dust of rubble in the air, as if an entire country were collapsing inch by inch in the cold. There were hardly any young men left on the roads. If they were not at the front, they were in hospitals or cemeteries. Those who remained were the elderly, the women, and the children. Guard posts were severely understaffed, and every adult still able to stand was forced to assume some kind of temporary duty, so the prisoner of war camps became loose and chaotic as a result. Against this backdrop, formations of American bombers took off from England, passing through cloud layers and high-altitude winter winds to carry out daytime raids against the industrial region along the Rhine. Lieutenant Samuel "Sam" Harrington, 27 years old, was the co-pilot of one of the heavy bombers. His crew had flown countless long-range missions, endured nighttime returns, handovers with fighter escorts, and the dangers of dwindling fuel. And they had also seen the blinding white bursts of dense anti-aircraft fire exploding beside the fuselage. The war had reached a stage where risk could no longer be measured. Each takeoff meant entering a tunnel of fate that was constantly narrowing. On that day, just after the bomber formation separated from its escorting fighters, the cloud cover over western Germany began to break apart. The altimeter shuddered, and batteries of anti-aircraft guns around the city opened up in unison. Sam sat on one side of the cockpit, the orders in his headset sounding without pause as the aircraft shuddered and slipped off course. Within just a few minutes, the port engine was hit, flames spread along the metal skin, and the temperature in the cabin rose sharply. Sam and the pilot made their final decision. Unable to maintain altitude, they gave the order to the crew to bail out. He left the aircraft amid freezing air and the pressure of high-altitude winds, and his parachute deployed in the shortest possible time. In his field of vision lay half-destroyed railway lines, collapsed factory buildings, and a silent winter landscape of fields. It was the most typical scene of Germany in the final phase of the war: dead trees, barren farmland, paralyzed tracks, and hastily abandoned houses. When Sam hit the ground, the impact jarred his knee, and his shoulder was grazed where the wind had dragged his body off alignment. Barely had time to struggle before he was discovered by local militia nearby. They showed no sign of triumph or excitement, only checked his identity with dulled eyes, and then, without any unnecessary words, marched him toward the nearest town. Frozen, muddy water had pooled along the road, wagons lay broken, food ration stations were empty, and windows had been boarded up. Along the way, every face he saw bore the hollows carved by long-term deprivation: sunken eye sockets, protruding cheekbones, cracked lips. No one glared at him, and no one showed open hostility. What he felt instead was a tired sort of scrutiny, as if they were not looking at an enemy soldier, but at yet another piece of evidence that the war was dragging on. At the makeshift holding point, his personal belongings were searched. There were no weapons, no photographs, and no documents that might arouse suspicion. The only thing they pulled out was a block of cold-weather ration chocolate, frozen rock-hard in the winter air. The guard's fingers passed over the rough, brown lump without any change in his expression, as though in a Germany on the verge of defeat, this piece of food was no more precious than anything else. They simply put it back into his pocket, then marched him and other captured airmen to a small, rudimentary prisoner-of-war camp. It was a place guarded jointly by local militia, retired veterans, and disabled soldiers, a site that might once have been an agricultural storage barn and was now only barely sufficient to confine prisoners. There were no complete fences, not enough guards, and no stable supplies. Everyone knew the war had gone on too long. Inside the camp and outside it, people were waiting for it to end, though no one knew in what manner that end would come. Sam was assigned to a small labor detachment, and their task was to clear scattered sleepers and rubble from a bombed-out branch line of the railway. This section was no longer sufficient to support larger-scale transport and could not even be repaired to its original standard, but the local guards were still ordered to make the prisoners carry out basic clearing work, so that some retreating units or refugee carts might briefly pass through. The job was monotonous, freezing, and almost devoid of practical meaning, yet the guards no longer had the strength to demand anything more. Their uniforms were worn, their boots split open, most of their rifles were outdated models, and even the slings were patched together in haste. One of the guards was a retired soldier nearing 60, recalled to home defense duty because of wounds that had taken him from the front. Every day he brought an 8- or 9-year-old child with him, forced to let the boy stand in a corner of a shed near the worksite because there was no one left at home to watch him. The child's clothes were thin, the cuffs frayed, the soles of his shoes almost coming apart. His cheeks were sharp from long-term malnutrition, and his hands, exposed to the harsh wind, were red and swollen, as if the skin might split at any moment. The boy kept his head lowered most of the time, but now and then he would lift his eyes to look at the prisoners as food was being handed out. He did not come closer, and there was nothing greedy in his manner. He only stared at the faint steam rising from the metal mess tins, as if that were the one thing in this winter that could make him stop in his tracks. Sam noticed the child for the first time one afternoon. The sky was overcast, and leftover snow, mixed with coal dust from the tracks, swirled in the wind. The prisoners stood in line to receive their rations for the day. In each iron tin there was only a little thin gruel and a small piece of hard, dry bread. Sam held his food in both hands, and as he turned his head he saw the boy standing where the wind was slightly weaker, his eyes fixed on the steam rising from the tin. It was not the look of someone begging, but a reflex born of long-term hunger, as if the body reacted before thought. Behind him, his father, the guard, stood up as straight as he could, as though using the last of his strength to prevent the boy from appearing weak. In that moment, Sam understood that in this country on the verge of collapse, those who were called enemies were trapped in their own winter as well. That afternoon, the wind was even sharper than usual, cutting through the air like fragments of fine metal. The worksite was almost silent, save for the dull thud of hammers striking stone along the broken rails. The distant forest was crusted with frost, its grey and white tones interwoven, as though the world's brightness had been scraped away, leaving only the flat palette of a war nearing its end. As Sam hefted sleepers, he once again noticed the boy. He was still standing in the same place, fingers curled inside his tattered sleeves, trying as best he could to hide from the cold. When he shifted his foot, the rip in his shoe opened in the wind, exposing the torn fabric beneath. His gaze did not rest on any particular prisoner, but on the thin veil of warmth rising from their food. It was one of the few signs of heat in that season, and perhaps the only thing he saw all day that carried any trace of warmth. Sam opened his tin at the back of the line. Frost clung to the lid, and it scraped softly as he lifted it. He looked down at a portion no larger than anyone else's, and hesitated for the briefest moment. He thought of the cold the day he bailed out, of the long missions when he had relied on a block of chocolate ration to get through the exhaustion, and of the home across the ocean where supplies had never been a problem. In that life, chocolate was an ordinary thing. Something slipped into a pocket before a flight, a standard item to keep a man alert in thin air. Here, however, it carried a different weight. For a German child in this time, it was something he might not see even once in a year. He slipped his hand into his pocket and closed his fingers around the block of chocolate, the edges hardened sharp by the cold. Without attracting attention, he broke off a small piece and walked, slowly and deliberately, to a place where the boy could see him. He did not go closer. He simply laid that small piece of chocolate on the rim of his mess tin, his movements gentle without any hint of insistence. The wind blew down from the north, sweeping iron dust and coal across the track. The tiny brown fragment lay there, motionless, a barely noticeable contrast against the surrounding cold colors. The moment the boy saw it, his whole body stiffened. It was the reaction of someone drawn forward and holding back at the same time, the product of years of hunger pulling on the same nerve as caution. His eyes moved from the chocolate to his father. The guard's shoulders trembled slightly, as though tugged by reality and instinct at once. He looked at the chocolate, and in his gaze lay hesitation, shame, exhaustion, and desire. He was not worried the boy would get sick from it. He was wondering whether accepting it would mean admitting that his household had fallen into utter ruin. In the end, he made only the smallest motion, a faint nod that was part permission, part surrender to a reality he could no longer resist. Seeing his father's consent, the boy stepped forward, his movements stiff, as if afraid of disturbing something fragile. He extended his hand and paused again just before touching the chocolate, then finally took it into his palm. As the sweetness slowly melted on his tongue, his shoulders eased a little, and the cold dullness in his eyes gave way to a faint glimmer. In that instant, no one at the site spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause for the brief warmth of that moment. The work continued, but the air had quietly changed. The guard stood to one side, his fingers resting on the old rifle without tightening. His eyes flicked briefly between the boy and Sam, then turned away quickly, not out of anger, but because he could not bear the complicated feeling of an enemy giving his child something sweet. There was a heaviness in his gaze, not the weight of gratitude, but the sluggishness born of long-term scarcity pressing down on a man. Along that shattered rail line, people sensed for the first time that a single piece of chocolate could open a crack in hostility. In the days that followed, the air continued to shift in subtle ways. The guards no longer shouted as harshly, and the prisoners' movements were no longer so rigid. When the father walked his rounds, his steps grew lighter, as if he did not wish to wake those struggling to sleep in the cold. The other guards, though unaware of the chocolate, noticed that their comrades' attitude had changed. Exhausted and numb, they had no strength left to question it. In the final phase of the war, as long as order did not collapse, they preferred not to interfere with anything that might make the days even slightly easier to bear. The boy began to linger for longer. He did not approach Sam, but when Sam went to collect his food, the boy would occasionally cast him a brief glance. It was a cautious kind of watching, not dependence and not expectation, but a tentative exploration of some new possibility. He had never known sweetness in his life, and that small piece of chocolate had become a kind of proof. Proof that the world was not made entirely of hunger and winter. One day, the weather felt heavier than usual. The artillery in the distance fired in quick succession, and the front line was clearly drawing nearer. The boy's lips were pale from the cold, his fingertips purple, and he was obviously weaker than he had been a few days before. The soles of his shoes had split completely, and his feet rested directly on the wet, freezing ground. Watching him, Sam realized how much more fragile the boy looked without the scarf around his neck. He understood at last that the scarf had never been just a way to keep the child warm, but a symbol, a fragment of a home still preserved even after it had been broken by war. Later, on a midday when the wind was especially fierce, the father suddenly walked up beside Sam. He said nothing and made no signal, only slipped his hand into his pocket, took out an old woolen scarf, and quietly placed it in Sam's hand. The movement was quick and tense, as if he feared being seen by the others. The yarn of the scarf was worn, the corners frayed, and it carried the smell of everyday life, the warmth of something that had once belonged to a family. When Sam touched it, he felt a strange yet unmistakable jolt, not one of the emotions common in war, but a gentle humanity coming from another household. He understood that this was not a trade, but a gesture of thanks from a father under crushing pressure, still trying to express something that words could not. The scarf stayed folded in his pocket. From that day on, his movements grew more subdued. During labor, he no longer made a point of avoiding the guard, but kept a natural distance. The boy sometimes stood a little nearer, though he remained cautious. His eyes no longer focused only on the food. There was a new kind of attention in his gaze, one that told Sam the boy had fixed that piece of chocolate in his memory, not because of its taste, but because it had given him, in the ruins of war, his first sense of warmth from the enemy's world. Along that broken stretch of railway, everyone was still struggling to survive, but the air between them had changed. Hostility had not disappeared, duties still had to be carried out, and hunger and cold continued to torment each person. Yet in some deeper layer they no longer saw one another purely as enemies, but as ordinary people caught in the same unending winter. A single piece of chocolate and a single scarf could not change the war, but for these three people in this shattered corner, they proved that humanity could still kindle a faint light amid the ruins, a light that the wind and snow could not entirely extinguish. In early March, Western Germany saw several days of unbroken overcast skies. Daylight seemed constantly draped in grey cloth. The air was thick with dampness, and artillery in the distance sounded ever more frequently, the vibrations sometimes running through the ground and making the sleepers tremble. At dawn, the guards began gathering their equipment with greater haste, as though the world beyond the camp were pressing in on this patch of land. Railway debris was no longer the main concern. The labor detail was ordered to shorten its trips outside and spend more time inside the compound. The shift did not come all at once, but it carried a tension that could not be ignored, as if everyone were waiting for an inevitable conclusion. The food in the camp grew scarcer still. The thin gruel, already watery, was diluted further, and the bread rations grew lighter. Many prisoners moved more slowly as long-term hunger took its toll. Shoulders and knees often cracked on cold mornings, stiff from the chill. The guards were no better off. Their own rations had been cut to nearly the same level as the prisoners. The elderly guard's face had grown noticeably more gaunt in the past weeks, cheekbones jutting out, dark hollows beneath his eyes like a fatigue that would not lift. During roll call, he often paused, as though he needed extra effort just to keep his voice steady. The boy's condition worsened with the weather. His footsteps were so light they barely made a sound, and each time he stopped, it was as if he had exhausted his strength. The frayed cuffs of his coat no longer hid the frostbite on his hands. His fingertips had turned a dark purple. Even so, he still appeared at the edge of the camp before each day's labor began, quietly and self-consciously staying close to his father, as if afraid of being left behind without warning. His gaze was calmer than before. Hunger no longer drove him to seek out the sight of food. It had sunk into his body, becoming a sluggishness rather than an impulse. One afternoon, the artillery suddenly sounded much closer than usual. The entire camp froze in a kind of uneasy stillness. The prisoners were ordered back into the sheds, and the guards formed a loose cordon around the perimeter. Sam sat inside one of the huts and watched through the cracks in the boards as the old guard pulled the boy into his arms. His movements were no longer restrained, but openly anxious. His eyes were fixed on some distant point, lips pressed tight, as if he were trying to calculate how fast the front was approaching and at the same time bracing himself for something he could not prevent. In the days that followed, news of the advancing front arrived one fragment at a time. The road outside the camp became more chaotic. Refugees trickled eastward, wagons mixed with people on foot carrying what possessions they could and wearing expressions of exhaustion that could not be hidden. The guards began to speak more often of retreat, but their discussions contained no clear plan, only the same words repeated again and again. Not enough time, no supplies, no transport, no clear orders. Everyone understood that if fighting reached the camp, they would have neither the means to mount a proper defense nor the capacity to go on guarding prisoners. Amid this confusion, the old guard grew even more silent. He no longer supervised the labor closely or shouted at the prisoners. Instead, he spent more time with the boy. He wrapped the child tightly in a worn blanket, laid a hand against the back of his neck to warm him, and then, after a brief moment, let go again and sank back into silence. From a short distance away, Sam watched and realized that the war was driving every family to its limits, and that this old man had almost nothing left with which to resist the harshness bearing down on him. His back, bent against the wind, seemed to carry the weight of the entire winter. One morning, the line of guards was suddenly thinner. At roll call, Sam noticed that several faces were missing. Later, word spread that those guards had been recalled to the front, perhaps to be thrown into makeshift defensive lines. The elderly guard remained, but looked even more haggard. He held the boy closer, no longer requiring him to stand in formation during roll call. When the wind rose, the boy rested his head against his father's chest like a small animal clinging on in a snowstorm. His face was almost translucent, his lips split, and his breathing shallow and light. Under this tight and heavy atmosphere, one evening in March, the explosions in the distance suddenly ceased. No news reached the camp immediately, but the air felt as if a taut string had been loosened. The guards exchanged glances, uneasy, yet quietly expectant. The old guard stared hard at the gate, as though waiting for some sign that would decide their fate. The boy leaned against his father's leg, his thin body trembling. That night the wind blew from the west, carrying a strange smell. It was not smoke or burning coal, but the odor of metal and oil mingled together. Everyone understood that the front was now very close. At daybreak the sky had an unusual brightness. The mist had not yet lifted, but light filtered through with a faint, unfamiliar clarity. The road outside the camp had been disturbed during the night. A few short bursts of engine noise had crossed the distance, then vanished into the trees. During roll call, the guards' unease was obvious. They clutched their rifles tight against their chests, but seemed to have no real sense of direction, as if waiting for orders that would never arrive. The old guard stood at the head of the line, the boy pressed against him, buried in his worn coat. From within the ranks, Sam watched them and sensed a heavy, almost indescribable quiet. It was not discipline, but a shared premonition, weighing on everyone. By midday, the premonition became reality. From far off came the sound of tracks grinding through mud, more certain than any artillery. The guards froze where they stood, and even the air seemed to stiffen with that unfamiliar rhythm. The old guard lifted the child into his arms and turned toward the outer fence of the camp, reacting on instinct, as though he could shield the boy from whatever was coming. Chains rattled, engines roared, and a small American armored reconnaissance unit emerged from the tree line. After pausing for a few seconds, they rolled forward. Their vehicles were painted in weathered olive drab, their helmets spattered with fresh mud, bearing the marks of long marches. No one fired a shot, and no resistance was offered. The American soldiers surveyed the area, and once they were sure there was no threat, they quickly secured the perimeter of the camp. The old guard stood where he was, holding the child as if frozen by the sight. It was not fear, but an inability to grasp what this change meant. The boy buried his face in his father's shoulder, his faint breath warming the old man's chest. Amid the confused but non-violent movement that followed, Sam was led toward the center of the camp. When he looked back, he saw the old guard still clutching the boy in a cloud of rising dust, as if they no longer belonged anywhere and had nowhere to hide. It was not the posture of a defeated man, but the instinctive stance of someone at war's end trying to protect the last thing that mattered to him. The liberation took less than half an hour. The prisoners were gathered on one side of the camp. The guards were ordered to lay down their weapons. They did not resist, and they did not argue. Their faces showed no fear, only the emptiness of people completely spent. The old guard was separated from the others by American soldiers and forced to set the child down amidst the brief confusion. The boy was taken to a safer corner. His body was so light, it seemed the wind might carry him away. As Sam passed them under the guidance of a medic, he saw the boy lift his head, his eyes blinking in the unfamiliar brightness. For a moment his gaze stopped on Sam, as if trying to recognize him or trying to see some sign that would make sense of what was happening. In the processing and registration that followed, Sam was taken to a temporary reception center in the rear. The procedure was orderly. Soldiers moved between grey-white tents recording the details of each prisoner in thick files. On a long table used for collecting bags, objects from different camps lay scattered: torn coats, hand-mended gloves, blackened mess tins, old identity tags lost and found again during attempts to escape. Sam placed his few possessions on the table, including the woolen scarf the old guard had slipped to him. The officer, writing on the form, paused for a second, clearly uncertain how to classify it. It was neither military issue nor any known item of ration. Sam picked the scarf back up, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his own pocket. He understood that it was not a trophy nor just a souvenir, but a fragment of another life, a piece of humanity the war had unexpectedly allowed him to see. He knew it could not take him home, nor could it answer the question of why the war had happened, but it could remind him that in the darkest years there had been a child whose small light had been sparked by a piece of chocolate, and a father who, in the final chaos, had placed his most precious household object into his hands. Before leaving Germany, Sam lingered for a moment beside a supply truck outside the camp. He looked at trees burned black by shellfire and the churned mud tracked by armored vehicles, and realized that war had pressed this land into a shape it could never fully recover from. Yet by that shattered railway line, he had witnessed something else, something that could not be destroyed by explosives. It did not belong to institutions or to armies, but to the instinctive warmth of human beings, the capacity to offer kindness even when submerged in hunger, fear, and winter. Many years later, in an interview about his time as a prisoner, Sam fell silent for a long time when recalling that winter. He did not dwell on the hardships of forced labor or the danger of bailing out. Instead, he spoke of the chocolate. He said it had not been his own generosity that mattered, but the first time he had seen the vulnerability of a family on the enemy's side. He said that piece of chocolate had allowed a child to taste sweetness and had shown him that, beyond the fractures of war, the world might still be capable of healing. At the end of a war, people are accustomed to judging the value of a chapter in history in terms of victory or defeat. Yet in the winter ruins of that time, it was the small, overlooked acts of kindness that proved hardest to extinguish. They did not attempt to change the course of the conflict, but they reminded people that violence could not entirely erase humanity. In the coldest of years, even a single piece of chocolate could allow two opposing worlds to glimpse each other, if only for a moment.